I have a feeling that your idea of retirement would be like your retirement, quote unquote, from inside Michigan politics. An adjustment into something new, an adjustment into something different, an adjustment into a different use of your time and your schedule.
I think that's absolutely right. Yeah, I mean, I think there are different ways you can do things. I feel, for instance, like right now with the podcast and the talk radio program, I'm actually doing something that's easier to do and more natural for me to do, and actually maybe better for me to do than writing. I mean, I don't necessarily think I've ever really made of myself as a writer what I dreamed when I majored in English literature back at Princeton I could become. But when I talk on radio or on TV, I feel I can pretty much do it right or do it nearer to the standard that I aspire to.
You are considered the expert pundit when it comes to Michigan history and Michigan government. Do you view yourself as that? Or is that just a label that I guess the rest of the political world has kind of dubbed you with?
Well, I think...
What is a pundit?
Well, a pundit is really a predictor, a commentator, an analyst. It's beyond simply being a reporter, a journalist, a scrivener, somebody who gives you the facts. You go to a pundit to ask his or her opinion in addition to plumbing the depths of his or her knowledge. I would say, I think the title has been conferred upon me by others, mainly because longevity. I've just been around so long, and people look and they say everybody else is gone. They're either dead or retired or resigned. This anomaly, this holdover from a bygone era, from the Paleolithic age, is still with us, walking the earth like a Tyrannosaurus Rex. And so we've got to view him as something unique. But I will say, when you talk about a historical political pundit, there are a lot of people here in the state who are fantastic historians. But how much about politics do they really know? And there are a lot of people who know a lot about politics in Michigan, but how much political history do they really know? I mean, I noticed, for instance, there's been a lot of talk recently about the state administrative board. And, the governor has said, look, this has been around for 98 years. And I thought, yeah, in 1921, Alexander J. Grossbeck founded it. He was the Republican governor, and guess what? It existed at that time, and nobody has pointed this out, of people who were almost entirely elected officials on their own, individual. We had a new constitution come in 60-61. Now most of the people, except for the Attorney General and Secretary of State, are appointed by the governor.
Yeah, we used to elect our superintendent and our treasurer.
Absolutely, every one of those people, transportation, Auditor General, everybody, they were all elected. And they were elected independent of governor. You had many years in Michigan's past when you had totally split government. You'd have a governor of one party. You could have a lieutenant governor of a different party. We had a different lieutenant governor from the governor's party as recently as 1963-64. T. John Lisinski and George Romney, famous stories about them. That was the last time we had it. So, I mean, the point is, when people make these comments like 98 years, I'm not going to give this power up. Well, I wouldn't give it up either if I were the governor at this point. And I wonder if she really knows how far she has deviated in using that power now from what Grossbeck thought it was going to be used as in 1921, and as the officials elected at that time thought it would be.
That's interesting, because now it's a tool of the governor, whereas back then it was not necessarily a tool of the governor.
No, not necessarily, and used for a completely different purpose.
How interesting. I wanted to go back to something that you said a while ago about the 1982 walk around the state. I just really find this extremely fascinating. What do you think you could have done differently in that race to have won? To actually have won, because what you did is so different than what you could possibly do today. But I'm curious if there was anything you could have done there to have actually won while still doing what you did.
One word: money. Raise more money. When Lamar Alexander did this in Tennessee, Lawton Childs in Florida, they were able to get off the hiking trail, the walking trail, and raise money. It was a little easier for Alexander, for instance. He was older than I was at the time. He had run for governor once. He was a lawyer. He'd worked for Howard Baker, the U.S. Senator. He had a lot of connections, so he was able to raise a lot of money. You got to reinforce the message from the walk. You got to remember, the people who knew about the walk were just reading about it in the newspaper from reporters. There were no ads. I had no ads. I mean, I ran the lowest budget U.S. Senate campaign. It's got to be in the last 40 years. I mean, I really only raised and spent about $50,000. $50,000.
And you finished in second place.
I finished in second place.
Wow.
And so, I mean, I basically had no money. I'll say one other thing I forgot to mention earlier that was really intriguing about the walk was the people who followed the walk cared about it so much that they would actually come up to me on the road, total strangers. The car would stop on a shoulder as I'm walking down the highway. I always walk facing traffic on the shoulder. And somebody would get out of the car and I thought, uh-oh. But they would come up to me and they'd say, I'm Joe Blow from Howard City. And nice to meet you. I'd say, oh, great. Great to meet you, Joe. He said, are you coming to Howard City? I'd say, well, you know, I actually think I'll get through there, but it'll be another month or two. Well, will you just get a ring? Here's my card. Here's my number. Give me a ring, and you can stay at my house. You can stay overnight. I'll put you up when you get there. 44 times. I stayed in 44 different houses with total strangers during on this walk.
What an experience.
Going through the state. I mean, people would coming up. It was unbelievable. So, I mean, I had all sorts of experiences like that I'll never forget. And I can't go anywhere in Michigan nowadays driving without crossing some intersection and saying, oh my God, I remember when I was there. I remember the walk, you know, in 1982, you remember it.
You have so many vignettes, so many stories.
Yeah.
You've known so many people, so many interesting little sidebars. You just mentioned some about your hike. Can you just list some of the wonderful people, stories, important people, not so people who have just kind of formed the fun of all of this? Or maybe they've been extraordinarily...
You mean overall in politics, the entire
Overall
suite?
in politics,
well, I mean,
the
certain
constituents?
there's certain people you remember. I mean, John Engler, we've talked about previously. John Engler was only, like 21 years old when he was first elected, and he had me actually come up and speak to his Beale City commencement, give the Beale City commencement address, and go over to the Engler farm and have dinner afterwards. I still remember it back in, I think it was like 71 when I was a senator and he was a freshman state rep. And then we had the district office together in Greenville for a year where he was the Maytag repairman. And, I obviously have always had a good relationship with John Engler during the years. I remember him calling me up when he was governor years after I was racing commissioner and saying, I'm thinking about making so-and-so my racing commissioner. And the guy he was considering was named Nelson Western. He was my legal counsel. And I said, you know what, Governor? That would be an inspired choice. Appoint him. And he did. And Nelson Western was a great racing commissioner. He's the late, unfortunately, Nelson Western now, since passed on, but he was great. So, I mean, I remember John Engler and his family. I went to his wedding in San Antonio when he married Michelle de Munburn. And other people, obviously, Milliken, I remember a lot. I remember a lot about George Romney. I went to George Romney's funeral. Does anybody know where George Romney is buried?
Canada.
No, he's buried in Brighton.
Brighton.
Why Brighton? Remember I mentioned Jerry Rowe? Lenore Romney, George's wife, came to Jerry Rowe and said, where should we bury George? And Jerry Rowe said, well, he presided over American Motors as president, living in Bloomfield Hills. And then he spent, a great time in Lansing as governor of the state. How about halfway in between? Brighton. And they picked out a cemetery in Brighton they had no connection with, and he was buried there. And I remember I was at the gravesite, and everybody had left, and Jerry Rowe and I watched his casket being lowered into the ground. We were the last two people there when it was lowered into the ground. So, I mean, there are things like that you remember. I still remember George Romney lying in state in the rotunda in the Capitol, and it was an open casket, and he had this long hair that he'd let grow. He looked like some kind of Old Testament patriarch, a Mormon patriarch, which is really what he was. He was a Mormon. And so, I mean, there are incredible stories like that, other figures, major figures over time. Some of them reporters. I remember some of the great old reporters, Bob Longstaff, Glenn Engel, Roger Lane, Hugh McDermott, people think of as old time. He retired nearly 20 years ago. He was recent for me. He came to Michigan for the first time when I was in Washington in the Ford administration. I'd already served all my time in elective office by the time he got here. So the reporters I knew were ancient, going way back in time. And, obviously the news media has changed dramatically over time. It's downsized substantially. And I would say, Kyle, that your newsletter, the Michigan Information Research Service, MERS and Gongwer, I mean, really, you are today, to me, what the old-time really great newspapers like the Free Press and News were when they were fully staffed in Lansing with, a full-time bureau and so-called. You have the influence and the knowledge base, and what you impart to people who read you is really what journalism was for 150 years before you came on the scene in the last 2 decades.
Well, I appreciate that, Bill. I appreciate that compliment. And why do you think that is? Why do you think that we have shied away, as far as a country, away from covering state or even local government? What's happening?
I think it's economics. I mean, look, it's the internet. It's social media. I mean, you can't have a successful financial economic model as a newspaper, which depended on advertising. Why do people have to necessarily pay for anything they can get free online? And so finding the economic model for journalism is what will save journalism. The real question is, can it be saved? Can that model ever really be saved? I mean, journalism is doing everything it can. For instance, like right now, if one of my motives is in the Ballenger report to actually make some money on it, I'm going to have to, do some things that I have been considering for some time that I haven't done yet. Whether they will work or not, I don't know. But it's a constant struggle. And if you don't have the money to afford the staff, then you have to downsize. And I think you've got the right model, MERS and Gongwer. I mean, you get a fairly high-priced commodity that people have to have. I mean, there was one bit of advice I got from a Tennessee Journal publisher back in the 1980s, before I started Inside Michigan Politics. He said, if you're going to start this newsletter, never overestimate the number of people who are going to subscribe to it, but never underestimate those who feel they have to have it, are willing to pay. Mm-hmm. Now, that combination, if you think about it, that is a successful model. And that is, whether you put it in those words or not, what you have done at MERS and what Gongwer has done. Mm-hmm. And no other newspaper, publication out there covering politics and government has been able to do that.
I also wanted to ask about how politics has changed. We hear in 2019 about how this is the most divisive time in politics, and considering the entire history of this country, it's just kind of hard to believe. It just kind of seems like hyperbole. But compare politics of today, 2019, to politics from back when you were involved in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, the aughts.
Well, look, the biggest thing is obviously money and term limits. Everybody talks about those two things. Because when I first ran for office in 1968, I got to tell you, you won't believe this, I was ashamed to be seen as raising too much money in the race. Yeah. I had 7 opponents in a Republican primary in the summer of 1968. 7 opponents. It was the biggest Republican primary in the state. And I think more votes were cast in that primary in my district than all but one other district in the state. And I remember I, desperately wanted one or more of my opponents to outspend me. Definitely. I mean, I did not want the stigma of being seen as buying the race, okay? And in fact, 2 of my opponents did outspend me. And I was really proud of that because I finished first in an 8-member primary with 27% of the vote. So nearly 3 out of every 4 voters voted against me. But I still won easily because 3 guys tied for second at about 18% apiece. And another guy got like 12% and another, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, contrast that to today, Kyle. I mean, you read any story about somebody setting out to run for anything, and the first thing you see is how much money have they raised? And what is the financial report? I mean, there's so much that's happened. Going back to the U.S. Supreme Court decision, Buckley versus Vallejo in 1976, campaign financing, decisions that have been made since then, the rise of political action committees, independent expenditures, the Citizens United decision of the Supreme Court in 2010. I mean, spending is off the charts. Well, I mean, that is just, I'm not going to say ruin things, but it just totally changed the dynamics. And then the other thing is term limits. Everybody talks about it. And I'm not going to dump on term limits, okay? I'm not as down on term limits, although I always voted against it. I always said it was a terrible idea. And all these people who come around cringing and moaning now saying, oh my God, I voted for term limits and I made a mistake. I said, well, you dummy. I told you at the time. I said, what do you expect? And they said, well, you're right. How can we get rid of it? I said, guess what? You're probably not going to get rid of it, okay? But the point is, it does cut off the possibility of legislators, and particularly legislators, getting to know each other, really spending time with each other, building up relationships. So I think that's really important. But I'm going to say one other thing, kind of contrary to what I just said. All this idea that I hear nowadays about, oh my God, back in the good old days, everybody got along. We reached across the aisle. We all went out and drank together afterwards, and, everything was, amicable, and I mean, whatever differences we had on the House and Senate floor, we left them behind, and we went off, and we caroused together. We were colleagues. We were buddies. That is BS, okay? That was not true. That was not true. There was more of it then, yes. More camaraderie then, but not that much more than there is now. I think one of the things that's changed is people used to live in Lansing more and not go home as much as they do now. And when people do stay here, they kind of room in these boys' dorms and for 2 nights or 3 nights, and then they drive back home and so forth. That is, a totally different dynamic than it used to be. But the idea that everything was sweetness and light between Republicans and Democrats in the so-called good old days, That isn't true, Kyle. There was a lot of animosity. There was a lot of mean-spiritedness. There were a lot of dirty tricks. Politics has not changed that much, and it will not ever change that much.
You got anything else?
No, I don't. I was going to say, on that note of political wisdom, are there any last questions?
No, I think I'm good.
Bill, we would like to thank you for your candor, for your memory, your history, for projecting all that you have, for your contributions to, in the last, half century and more to the state of Michigan and elsewhere. And thank you for this time with us.
Well, I'd thank the two of you. I mean, this is the first time the Michigan Political History Society's ever had two interviewers. That's a first. Probably will never happen again. And Susan, congratulations to you. You are the first female interviewer ever in the history of MPHS.
All right. Well, thank you, Bill. Thanks for the time.